Before the war, Exeter was the jewel of the West Country, Roman walls, medieval lanes, a cathedral with the longest Gothic vault in the world, and a Georgian crescent that visitors compared to Bath. On the night of the 4th of May 1942, the Luftwaffe burned 30 acres of it in 70 minutes. They hadn't come for the factories. Exeter didn't have factories. They'd come because the city was listed in a tourist guidebook, chosen for destruction purely because it was beautiful. Bedford Circus, Bampfield House, the Lower Market, gutted. But here's what most people don't know about Exeter. Many of those buildings were still standing the morning after the raid, roofless, scorched, but structurally intact. There are photographs that prove it. The man who wrote the plan to rebuild the city described one of them as utterly destroyed, shattered to bits. The photographs show it standing. The city council demolished it anyway. This is the story of a city that was bombed for being beautiful and then dismantled by the people who were supposed to put it back together. Chapter 1. Where the river narrows. Every city begins with a reason, a crossing, a harbour, a hilltop that commands a valley. For Exeter, it was all three. The River Exe, running south from the Exmoor uplands to the English Channel, narrows here against a ridge of red sandstone, navigable water meeting defensible ground, the oldest calculation in the story of settlement. The Romans understood it first. Around AD 55, the Second Augustan Legion, Legio II Augusta, the same legion that had stormed Maiden Castle and swept through the hill forts of Dorset, established a legionary fortress on that ridge under the command of the future Emperor Vespasian. They called it Isca Dumnoniorum, Isca from the Brittonic word for flowing water, Dumnoniorum for the Celtic tribe whose territory this was. The fortress covered some 37 acres. When the legion moved on around AD 75, the military infrastructure gave way to civilian. The bathhouse demolished, a stone forum and basilica built in its place. By the late 2nd century, the Romans had thrown walls around 92 acres of the settlement, walls of volcanic trap and purple breccia, 10 feet thick in places, following the contour of the ridge. Here is the fact that anchors everything that follows. Roughly 70% of those Roman walls still stand. Every medieval wall, every Tudor boundary, every Georgian terrace that later pressed against them, all of it sat on Roman foundations. The city that the Luftwaffe burned in 1942 was a city still contained, in large part, by walls that Vespasian's engineers had laid out 19 centuries earlier. After the Romans withdrew around 410, urban life at Exeter collapsed for the better part of 300 years. The written record goes dark. When it resurfaces, it does so through the church. St. Boniface, born Winfrith, the Devon man who would become the apostle of the Germans, was educated at Exeter's Abbey by 680. In 1928, Athelstan refortified the city against the Danes, repairing the Roman walls and driving the Britons west of the Exe. The Vikings sacked Exeter in 1003 regardless. In 1050, the Diocese of Crediton moved here and Bishop Leofric founded the Cathedral Library. Among its holdings, the Exeter Book, a 10th century manuscript of Anglo-Saxon poetry, riddles, elegies, laments for fallen halls, that remains in Exeter Cathedral to this day, one of only 4 surviving codices of Old English verse. It would be evacuated for safekeeping in 1940, and it would survive. Much around it would not. Then came the Normans. In late autumn 1068, after Exeter refused to swear fealty to William the Conqueror, Githa, mother of the dead King Harold, was sheltering inside the walls. William besieged the city for 18 days. When it fell, he ordered Rougemont Castle built into the northern angle of the Roman defences under Baldwin Fitzgilbert. The Domesday Book records 48 houses razed to make room. The castle's gatehouse, with its Anglo-Saxon long and short quoins and triangular-headed windows, reused masonry from the conquered city set into the conqueror's walls, is widely cited as the earliest standing Norman castle building in England. It still stands. It stood through the raids, and beneath and around the castle, the street pattern that would define Exeter for the next 9 centuries was already in place. The High Street ran arrow straight along the spine of the ridge from Eastgate to the Carfax, the old crossroads. Fore Street descended from the Carfax toward the river. South Street and North Street crossed the High Street at right angles. These were Roman alignments, and they'd been in continuous use as thoroughfares for 1,000 years before the Normans arrived. W.G. Hoskins, Exeter's great local historian, born on St. David's Hill in 1908, the man who would later mourn the city's destruction more eloquently than anyone, made the claim plainly. The High Street had been in continuous use for more than 2,000 years. That was the skeleton. The next 5 centuries would clothe it. Chapter 2. 5 centuries of stone and timber. The cathedral came first, or rather the cathedral came again. The Norman bishop William Warlewis began rebuilding Exeter Cathedral around 1133, and what he left behind were 2 massive transept towers, unusual in English cathedral architecture. Nicholas Pevsner, surveying them 7 centuries later, traced their parallels not to Canterbury or Winchester, but to Burgundy, a French echo in a Devon skyline. But it was the rebuilding that followed, between roughly 1275 and 1342, that produced Exeter's masterpiece. Master masons Thomas of Whitney and William Joy created a single unified decorated Gothic interior, no break in style from west to east, the vaulting flowing uninterrupted for about 96 metres. It remains the longest unbroken stretch of medieval Gothic vaulting in the world. The 60-foot bishop's throne carved in oak. The misericords, the 48 of them dating from the 1250s and 1270s, one of only 2 complete pre-1290 sets in England, the other being Salisbury's. The Great East Window of 1390-92 by Robert Lessingham, all of it enclosed within those 2 Norman towers, which held the space between them like bookends bracing a shelf of stone lace. Around the cathedral, the medieval city thickened. Tucker's Hall, built in 1471 on 4 Street, was the meeting hall of the incorporation of weavers, fullers and shearmen, the men who made Exeter rich. Pevsner called it a remarkable survival, and with reason. It was one of the last intact medieval guild halls in England, its barrel-vaulted roof and carved screen testament to the wealth that wool brought to Devon. And wool brought extraordinary wealth. Throughout the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, Exeter was one of the richest cities in England, built on the trade in woolen serge cloth. Daniel Defoe, visiting in 1727, called the South Street serge market the greatest in England outside Leeds. Celia Fiennes, riding through in 1698, watched dyers turning vats of black, yellow, blue and green, and admired colours she thought as fine as London's best. The Tudor and Elizabethan merchants built accordingly. Bampfield House, begun around 1590 by Richard Bampfield of Poltimore in what was then Raiden Lane, was the finest late 16th century house in the city. Strapwork plaster ceilings, an oak-panelled room, the Oak Room, with 3 mullioned windows and a carved overmantel dated 1639, showing King Charles III on horseback, flanked by allegorical figures of peace and plenty. The City Council bought it in 1934 and opened it as a museum. It would last 8 more years. On Catherine Street, just south of the cathedral, Canon John Stevens founded St Catherine's Almshouses and Chapel in 1457, 13 dwellings for 13 poor men, built of local heavy-tree breccia with beerstone dressings. The chapel's foundations, unknown to anyone in the 15th century, sat directly above a 4th century Roman house with mosaic floors. Those mosaics would only come to light after the bombs of 1942 stripped everything above them away. Moll's Coffee House at No. 1 Cathedral Close is the building most people recognise from old photographs of Exeter. A Dutch gabled timber-framed house that has come to stand, in reproduction and postcard, for the city's vanished character. It was built around 1596 by the cathedral authorities to house annullers, priests who sang anniversary masses. The Dutch gable, that most photographed feature, was actually a Victorian addition by Thomas Worth in 1879. The legend that Drake plotted the Armada from its upper rooms is largely Victorian invention too. But the building itself was real, and it survived the raids. It's one of the fragments still standing. Then came the Georgians, and with them the showpiece that would become the most controversial loss in Exeter's history. Bedford Circus was designed by Robert Stribling and Matthew Nosworthy, built between 1773 and 1825 on the site of the demolished Bedford House, where Princess Henrietta Anne, daughter of Charles V, had been born in 1644. 2 curving terraces of red brick townhouses faced each other across an oval railed green. Bedford Chapel, built 1831-32, sat in the centre of the South Range, Hoskins, in his Shell Guide to Devon in 1954, called it one of the finest pieces of Georgian town planning in England. In 1960, in 2000 Years in Exeter, he called its loss an unforgivable act of vandalism. But that loss was still 18 years in the future when the terraces were completed. In the 1820s, Bedford Circus was the pride of the city, Exeter's answer to Bath's Royal Crescent, proof that a medieval walled town could match the elegance of a spa. Dix's Field, a Regency development also laid out by Nosworthy, and the elegant stuccoed terraces of Southern Hay West completed the Georgian belt that wrapped around the cathedral quarter. Exeter was accumulating layers, medieval timber beside Georgian brick beside the occasional Tudor plaster ceiling hidden behind a later facade. And each layer added texture without erasing what came before. The Victorians added their own. Charles Fowler, born in Colompton in 1792, the same architect who designed Covent Garden Market in London, came home to Devon and built the Lower Market on 4th Street in 1835-36. Hayter granite, a neoclassical pediment, sculpted bulls' heads above the entrance, and the architect's own name incised over the door, as proud a signature as any on Covent Garden. Above the market, a corn exchange. John Hayward designed the Royal Albert Memorial Museum on Queen Street in 1865-69. Heavy, confident Victorian Gothic, a building that announced civic ambition. The Higher Market, completed in 1838 by John Diamond with Fowler's involvement, gave Queen Street a colonnaded commercial anchor. The Eastgate Arcade of 1882, glass-roofed and intimate, threaded through the line of the medieval East Gate. And then, in 1916, on the site of the demolished 17th century Half Moon Hotel, the firm of Hyams and Hobgon of Paynton built Della's Cafe. 3 stories, a Baroque entrance. Inside, an atrium that rose the full height of the building, with plaster friezes by Arthur Glover and ceilings by Jackson and Sons of London. A sprung-floor ballroom. It was Exeter's Edwardian palace of pleasure. Part tea room, part dance hall, part civic monument, and for 26 years it anchored the social life of the city centre. Hoskins would later call its loss perhaps the greatest single loss to Exeter in all the destruction of that terrible night. By the eve of war, the layers were complete. Roman walls, a Norman castle gatehouse, a decorated Gothic cathedral of European significance, medieval guild halls and timber-framed houses, Tudor merchant palaces with strapwork ceilings, a Georgian crescent that rivalled Bath, a Victorian museum, 2 markets, and a glass-roofed arcade, an Edwardian cafe with a sprung-floor ballroom, 5 centuries of stone and timber, 5 centuries of woolen trade and civic pride, all enclosed within the footprint of a Roman fortress on a red sandstone ridge above the Exe. Chapter 3, The Jewel of the West. To walk Exeter's High Street in 1939 was to walk through most of the previous millennium in half a mile. Start at the East Gate, or rather where the East Gate had stood before the Victorians replaced it with the Eastgate Arcade, its glass roof catching the morning light, and head west. Moll's Coffee House on your left as you entered Cathedral Close, its Dutch gable rising above the bookshops. The Royal Clarence Hotel across the yard, Britain's first inn to call itself a hotel, since 1769, its Georgian facade watching the cathedral green. The medieval timber-frame pair at Nostant 41 and 42, their brick fronts hiding Tudor cores, the upper floors leaning out over the pavement at angles that no surveyor would approve and no visitor would forget. Continue along the High Street and the centuries shuffled like a deck of cards. St. Stephen's Church, medieval, tucked between shop fronts. St. Lawrence's Church, with origins before the 13th century, its clock projecting out over the pavement on an iron bracket, a landmark so familiar that giving directions in the city centre meant giving them in relation to St. Lawrence's clock. Georgian banks with Portland stone porticos stood beside Edwardian department stores, Colson's, later Dingle's, Bobby's, Cogswell, and Harrison the gunmaker. Number 37, a 16th century timber-framed merchant's house, sat unremarked among them, one of those buildings that the city had grown so accustomed to that nobody photographed it properly until it was too late. Turn south down Bedford Street and the character shifted. Here the commercial bustle of the High Street gave way to something quieter, more composed. Bedford Street opened onto the Georgian ellipse of Bedford Circus, 22 red brick townhouses curving around their railed oval green, the Bedford Chapel centred in the South Range, the Devon and Exeter Bank anchoring the northwest corner. On a summer evening, the circus had the quality of a stage set, the symmetry, the warm brick, the green oval, but it was a stage set that people actually lived in, that had been lived in continuously since the 1780s. South of the circus, Bampfield House waited in its narrow lane, the Elizabethan strapwork ceilings, and the carved overmantel of Charles the on horseback, visible through mullioned windows to anyone who cared to look in. St Catherine's almshouses and their chapel stood a few streets further south, their heavy-tree breccia walls enclosing the memory of Canon Stephen's medieval charity, unknowingly sheltering their Roman mosaics below. Walk instead down Fore Street from the Carfax, and you descended toward the river through the city's oldest commercial quarter. Charles Fowler's Lower Market, its granite facade and sculpted bulls' heads facing the street. The Corn Exchange above, busy on market days. Further down, Tucker's Hall, 5 centuries of weavers' meetings behind a medieval barrel vault. St Mary Steps Church, with its clock whose 3 mechanical figures, known locally as Matthew the Miller and his 2 sons, struck the hours as they'd done since the 17th century. Stepcote Hill, narrow and cobbled, dropped away beside it, one of the steepest streets in the city, where medieval pack horses had once laboured up from the river crossing. Behind the High Street, the lanes and passages preserved the texture of the medieval city that the main streets had partly modernised. Goldsmith Street, Waterbeer Street, Paul Street, Smythen Street, narrow, irregular, running between the backs of buildings that faced the grander thoroughfares, their scale intimate and their character older than anything on the High Street itself, and threading through everything, the sounds and routines that made a city, the cathedral bells calling the hours, the market traders in Fore Street on Saturdays, their voices carrying up the hill, the cinema queues on a Friday night, the smell of hops from the 36 pubs and clubs that dotted the centre, the particular density of a city where everything was within walking distance, where you knew your neighbours' names because the streets were too narrow and the walls too thin for anonymity. Exeter in 1939 had a population of about 72,000. It wasn't a great industrial city. It wasn't a garrison town, not really. A small RAF airfield at Clyst-Honiton, a few miles east, was the nearest military installation of any note. It had no munitions works, no docks, no shipyards. What it had was the accumulated beauty of 20 centuries of habitation, Roman walls enclosing a medieval street pattern, enclosing a cathedral of European importance surrounded by the layered residue of Tudor, Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian civic life. Visitors compared it to Bath. Pevsner, writing after the destruction, would say the bombers found Exeter primarily a medieval city. What nobody in Exeter fully understood, not the city council, not the civil defence planners, not the 72,000 people going about their Saturday mornings in the shadow of the cathedral, was that this beauty, this concentration of history in a small and navigable centre had made the city a target, not a military target, something worse, a cultural one. Chapter 4, The Guidebook and the Directive. The first bomb fell on St Thomas across the river on 7th August 1940, 5 high-explosive bombs. The casualties, as the Express and Echo reported 2 days later, amounted to a canary that died of shock and a few chickens. For the next 18 months, the raids stayed small, scattered, almost casual, the Luftwaffe treating Exeter as a secondary nuisance on the way to or from Plymouth, which was absorbing devastating punishment. The city's defences reflected its low priority, no balloon barrage, negligible anti-aircraft batteries, and a chief constable who told the Gloucestershire Echo in June 1942 that the narrow medieval streets made Exeter a terrible fire risk. 1,200 part-time wardens and 16,000 fireguards were the sum of the city's active protection. For a city enclosed by Roman walls with a medieval street plan, built almost entirely of timber and plaster, it was not nearly enough. The event that sealed Exeter's fate happened 700 miles away. On the night of 28-29 March 1942, RAF Bomber Command launched 234 aircraft against the medieval Hanseatic port of Lübeck on the Baltic coast. The raid was, by the RAF's own admission, an experiment in area bombing. Lübeck was chosen in part because its tightly packed, half-timbered old town was expected to burn well. It did. Lübeck Cathedral and most of the medieval centre were destroyed. The German police report counted 301 dead, 3 missing and 783 injured, with more than 15,000 left homeless. Hitler, according to Goebbels' diary, was incensed. On 14th April 1942, Hitler signed the directive. Raids on British cities were to be carried out, where attacks were likely to have the greatest possible effect on civilian life. Goebbels wrote on 27th April, "Like the English, we must attack centres of culture, especially such as have little anti-aircraft. The targets wouldn't be factories or docks, they'd be chosen from a tourist guidebook." On 27th April 1942, after the campaign had already begun and Bath had been hit, Baron Gustav Braun von Sturm, deputy head of information at the German Foreign Office, told a room of foreign correspondents in Berlin, "We shall go out and bomb every building in Britain marked with 3 stars in the Baedeker Guide." The Baedeker publishing house's red tourist guides were the standard reference for cultured European travellers, elegant, thorough, and with a small technical irony that Sturm apparently missed, rated their highest recommendations with 2 stars, not 3. Goebbels was furious that Sturm had said the quiet part aloud, but the name stuck. The British press had already begun using it. From that moment on, the raids on Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York and Canterbury would be known as the Baedeker Raids, a campaign in which cities were chosen not because they made weapons, but because they were beautiful. Exeter was first. The initial Baedeker raid came on the night of 23 to 24 April 1942, St. George's Day Eve. 49 bombers set out, but heavy cloud meant most missed. 7 high-explosive bombs fell on St. Thomas and Marsh Barton, west of the river. 5 killed, 8 injured, 200 houses damaged. A Dornier was shot down by a bow fighter of 604 Squadron. It was a false start. British intelligence intercepted a Luftwaffe reconnaissance signal the following morning and understood what was beginning. The next night, 24 to 25 April, the sky cleared. 2 waves of about 20 bombers each, some flying 2 sorties, came in low over a moonlit city that had almost nothing to shoot back with. 60 high-explosive bombs and as many as 2,000 incendiaries fell across the Pennsylvania area. 73 killed, 54 injured, 6,000 houses damaged, 3 raiders shot down by night fighters. It was bad. It wasn't the worst. A smaller raid followed on the night of 25 to 26 April. 3 killed. Then the Luftwaffe turned to Bath, Norwich and York. Exeter waited. The wardens patrolled. The fire guards took their shifts. The buildings stood. For 8 days nothing happened. The city held its breath and the medieval streets, the High Street, Fore Street, Bedford Circus, the lanes behind the cathedral, stood in the early May sunshine with less than a week left. Chapter 5. 70 minutes. The raid that destroyed Exeter came in the small hours of Monday, 4th May 1942. A clear night. Visibility excellent. No cloud cover, no rain, no mercy from the weather. At 01:36, the air raid red sounded. 20 bombers, Junkers Ju-88s of Luftwaffe 3, flew up the Exe estuary in the first wave, dropping parachute flares that swung slowly over the city centre, turning the medieval roofscape into a lit stage. 15 minutes later, the incendiaries began to fall. They were small things. 1 kilogram magnesium thermite sticks, each one barely the length of a man's forearm. Around 8,000 of them came down across a 30-acre swathe of the city centre, along with high explosive bombs ranging up to 1,000 kilograms and parachute mines that drifted silently before detonating with a blast radius that could flatten an entire terrace. The combination was deliberate and practiced. The high explosives blew open roofs and shattered windows. The incendiaries lodged in the exposed timbers and plaster, and the parachute mines ensured that the fire crews couldn't get close enough to fight what followed. By 2 o'clock, 19 fires were burning. Mr. Restorick, a fireguard team leader, had placed 1 man on each of the 4 stories of the cooperative store on Eastgate, stationing himself on the roof as a watcher. Each man carried a whistle and could summon help from the others by signal blasts. 15 incendiaries hit the building that night. By working in relays, spotting, whistling, hauling sand and water up stairwells, Restorick's 4-man team saved the store with nothing worse than slight damage. It It was the kind of quiet, organised courage that saved individual buildings across the city, but it couldn't save the city. At 02:15, major fires were raging simultaneously in the High Street, Sidwell Street and Fore Street. Every available pump was engaged. 4 minutes later, the telephone exchange failed. Then the electric lighting went. Exeter's fire crews were now fighting a firestorm in the dark, relying on the light of the fires themselves to see what they were doing. The cathedral took its hit early. A single high-explosive bomb struck the chapel of St. James in the south choir aisle, destroying it completely, along with the muniment room above, 3 bays of the aisle, and 2 flying buttresses. The medieval rood screen opposite was smashed to pieces. Fire watcher Wilfred Diamond, whose account survives in an Imperial War Museum oral history, was inside. The cathedral was absolute chaos, he recalled. The organ was everywhere, pipes were everywhere. The whole of the south side of the choir was damaged. It was filled with smoke from fires burning all over the place. Not a window was left. Chairs were everywhere, masonry all over the place. It was devastation, but the cathedral's bones held. The longest unbroken Gothic vault in the world, Thomas of Whitney's masterwork of the 1320s, was untouched. The bishop's throne, the misericords, the Exeter book, and the great east window had all been removed in 1940 and sent to safe storage. The building was broken, but it was not gone. Almost everything around it was. Bedford Circus caught fire when burning debris from Hughes' garage drifted across. The north and south ranges, Stribling and Nosworthy's Georgian terraces, the ones Hoskins called one of the finest pieces of Georgian town planning in England, burned from the inside out. At the northwest corner, the Devon and Exeter Bank took a direct high explosive hit. 7 Home Guard men sheltering in its basement were killed. Bampfield House, the Elizabethan townhouse, with the strapwork ceilings and the carved overmantel of Charles the Throne on horseback, was hit by incendiaries. Totally destroyed, the post-raid report read. The oak room, the mullioned windows, the plaster ceilings that had survived the Civil War, the Monmouth Rebellion, the South Sea Bubble, and 3 centuries of Devon weather. Gone in a single night, in a raid ordered because the city appeared in a tourist guidebook. Della's Cafe ignited when the fires spreading along the high street reached its western wall. The 3-storey atrium, the sprung-floor ballroom, the plaster friezes by Arthur Glover. The building's roof and floors collapsed inward, but the gabled brick exterior walls held, damaged, gutted, but standing. That detail would matter later, and not in the way it should have. The lower market burned. Charles Fowler's granite shell, Haytor granite, the same stone as Covent Garden, resisted the flames better than timber or brick, but the interior was gutted. The corn exchange above it was destroyed. The sculpted bull's heads above the 4 Street entrance stared out over a street that was, by 3 in the morning, a corridor of fire. St. Lawrence's Church, its clock no longer projecting over a high street that no longer existed in recognisable form, was destroyed. St. Catherine's almshouses and chapel, Canon Stevens's 15th century charity for 13 poor men, burned through. An 11-year-old boy named James Bell walked through the chapel at noon on 5 May and saw no sign of fire. The flames from the neighbouring buildings spread overnight, and by morning the chapel was a shell. Beneath the rubble, the 4th century Roman mosaics that nobody had known were there waited to be uncovered by archaeologists who would arrive to record a loss and find beneath it a deeper past. The College of the Vicars Choral on South Street, Bishop Brantingham's medieval quadrangle, founded in 1388, its oak-panelled dining hall with the stone fireplace and the 1629 Royal Arms, was gutted. The Globe Hotel in Cathedral Yard, Tudor and Georgian, the Coaching Inn, where Sir John Graves, Simcoe, First Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, had been initiated as a Freemason in 1774, caught fire from South Street and was completely destroyed. The City Library on Castle Street, Exeter's main public library, pressed into service as the ARP control centre, was surrounded by flames. At 05:29 it was abandoned, its staff retreating through burning streets. About 1 million books, manuscripts and historic documents burned with it. A city's written memory gone with the buildings. Down in the Exe, the fire barge that supplied No. 6 hose line took a direct hit and sank, cutting water supply to the teams fighting fires along the southern edge of the blaze. At 02:30, the Haven Banks gasworks was ablaze. Bombers were strafing emergency workers in the streets. Marjorie Birch's mother, in a house in the residential streets east of the centre, grabbed an incendiary that had come through the bedroom ceiling, wrapped it in a rug, and tried to throw it from the window. She burned her hands and arms quite badly. That was brave, Birch recalled, but rather a silly thing to do, I suppose. But some of those incendiary bombs, if you approached them, they would blow up. At 2:50, the air raid white sounded. The Luftwaffe turned back toward northern France. They had been overhead for approximately 70 minutes. The fires didn't stop. At 05, Torquay reinforcements arrived. Water mains were failing. At 05:23, the entire block bounded by South Street, Market Street, Coombe Street and Fore Street was one conflagration. A high southwesterly wind throwing sparks across rooftops faster than any crew could follow. At 17:26, nearly 16 hours after the all clear, a column officer in Cathedral Close called for a turntable ladder to reach the upper floor of Colson's department store on the High Street, where the roof was still alight. The store was saved in the end by the firefighters and a 4-foot 6-inch cob wall that refused to burn. Outbreaks continued into 5, 6 and 7th of May. St Stephen's Church and St Mary Arches Church, both medieval, reignited on the 5th. 195 reinforcing pumps and 1,080 fire personnel were committed across the city. 39 unexploded high-explosive bombs had to be made safe, and overhead that night, 4 Bristol Beaufighter night fighters of the Polish 307 Squadron, the City of Lwów Squadron, based at RAF Clyst Honiton, had risen to meet approximately 40 bombers with almost no ground support. In 70 minutes, the Polish crews destroyed 4 Ju-88s without loss. Among the dead German aircrew buried afterwards in Higher Cemetery were Sergeant Bernhard Leiser of Dresden, aged 23, Wilhelm Pfeif of Frankfurt, 22, Ernst Keil of Nuremberg, 23, and Adolf Köppel. Navigator Zbyszko Lisowski, born in Poznan in 1920, flew that night with pilot Władysław Iwaszewicz. The locals called 307 Squadron the Guardian Angels. They were Poles, defending a Devon city that most of them had never seen before the war, against German bombers targeting buildings from a tourist guidebook. The absurdity of it was total. The courage was not. 156 people were killed in that single raid. 583 were injured. Among the dead, Emily Vanstone, 16, her parents Charles and Kate, and her grandmother Margaret, 80, all killed when 161 Monks Road took a direct hit. Samuel Richard Wotton, 69, and William Hawkins, 15, a London evacuee sent to Devon for safety, killed on fireguard duty near the tepid baths. Francis Clive Ross, Ensign actor and theatrical manager, who in his youth had managed a young Charlie Chaplin as a page boy in a touring production of Sherlock Holmes, killed at 2 Mowbray Avenue. Henrietta Baxter, Exeter's first ARP warden, killed in action, had already died in the earlier raid on 23rd April. Ernst von Kugel, a Luftwaffe U-88 pilot, said in a propaganda broadcast afterwards, "It was a night of terror for the Exeter people. When I approached this town, the bright reflections guided me. Over the town I saw whole streets of houses on fire. Flames burst out of windows and doors, devouring the roofs. With cold calculation we carried out our orders. German radio was more direct. Exeter is the jewel of the West. We have destroyed that jewel, and the Luftwaffe will return to finish the job." They didn't return. They didn't need to. 70 minutes had been enough. Chapter 6. What the morning showed. When the all clear had sounded at 02:50, the city was still burning. It would go on burning for days. By daybreak, around 30 acres of the centre, roughly a third of the area within the Roman walls, lay in ruins. The BBC's Frank Gillard, a young West Region war correspondent born in Tiverton, was sent down from Bristol to broadcast from the wreckage. His report, recorded among still smoking ruins, would later be cited as one of the most effective regional war broadcasts of 1942. What Gillard saw was a city whose commercial heart had been scooped out, the High Street a blackened canyon, Fore Street impassable, Bedford Circus a roofless shell, the lanes behind the cathedral a landscape of rubble and exposed chimney stacks, standing like headstones over the buildings they'd once warmed. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited on 8th May, 4 days after the raid. Shown a piece of shrapnel from the bomb that had hit the cathedral, the King said, "Send it for scrap." The Queen replied, "That's right, let us send it back to the Germans." The national press response was carefully managed. Churchill had told the War Cabinet as early as 27 April to ensure that disproportionate publicity was not given to these raids. The government wanted to avoid giving the impression that the Germans were making full reprisal for Lübeck. Yet on 29 April, the Daily Mail itself had already used the word Baedeker in a headline. In Parliament, a member asking about the raids was met with shouts of "What about Bath?" The Baedeker campaign had struck a nerve the government couldn't quite control. The numbers told one story. Across all four 1942 raids, 265 Exonians dead, 111 seriously injured, 677 with lesser injuries. 1,500 of the city's 20,000 houses obliterated, 2,700 seriously damaged, more than 16,000 with some damage. 400 shops gone, nearly 150 offices, more than 50 warehouses, 36 pubs and clubs. Many of the dead were buried in a mass grave in Higher Cemetery. Margaret Tomlinson told another story, a quieter one, but ultimately more consequential. Tomlinson worked for the National Buildings Record, the wartime photographic survey founded in 1941 that would become the nucleus of historic England. She came to Exeter with her camera and photographed the ruins. What her photographs showed, and what would matter enormously in the years ahead, was that many of the city's most important buildings were damaged but not destroyed, gutted, roofless, scorched, but structurally present. Standing, the Georgian terraces of Bedford Circus were standing, the gabled brick walls of Della's Cafe were standing, the granite shell of the Lower Market was standing, the facades of Southernhay West were standing, the surviving terraces of Dix's Field were standing. They were shells. They needed roofs and floors and windows and plaster, but their walls, their proportions, their facades, the things that made them Bedford Circus rather than any other row of buildings, were there, photographable, measurable, repairable, if anyone had chosen to repair them. John Summerson, co-founder of the National Buildings Record and later its deputy director, wrote to Tomlinson during the survey with a note that captures the clinical detachment the work required. It is important in our job never to be in the slightest degree ruffled by the destruction of unrecorded buildings. The only thing to do is to plod on regardless of what happens. In May 1943, Summerson himself came to Exeter and made measured drawings of damaged buildings under threat of demolition, including the Lower Market. Most of those buildings were demolished anyway. Chapter 7, The Architect and the Phoenix. On 26 October 1944, Exeter City Council appointed Thomas Sharp to plan the city's reconstruction. Sharp was 53. Born in Bishop Auckland, County Durham, the son of a coal miner, he trained as a surveyor and risen to become one of the most influential planning theorists in Britain. His 1932 Town and Countryside had attacked the Garden City movement as suburban mush. His 1940 Pelican paperback town planning, which he later claimed sold around 250,000 copies, had made him a household name among the kind of people who read Pelican paperbacks. He was president of the Town Planning Institute in 1945-46. He championed the dense, compact English town against the suburban sprawl that threatened to dissolve it into formless green porridge. His remit at Exeter was to consider the historical and architectural character of the city, the reconstruction of built-up areas, and particularly areas devastated by enemy action, and the allocation of undeveloped land to its best use. It was, on paper, a brief that respected the city's past. What it produced was a plan that replaced it. Sharp's book, Exeter Phoenix, A Plan for Rebuilding, published by the Architectural Press in March 1946, 153 pages, with colour fold-out maps, was unveiled in a public exhibition in the burnt-out shell of the City Library. Lewis Silkin, Minister of Town and Country Planning, opened it on 29th of December 1945. It ran until 19th of January 1946. 28,035 visitors went through. A modified version was adopted by the Council in September 1947. What Sharp proposed was, in essence, a modernist rebuild on the medieval street plan. He wanted to keep the lines of the High Street, Fore Street and South Street intact, the Roman alignments, the 2,000-year-old thoroughfares, but to widen them and to build new modern elevations rather than reproducing what had been there. His centrepiece was Princess Hay, a new pedestrianised shopping street running parallel to the High Street through the bombed Bedford Circus area with a vista terminating on the cathedral. He proposed a partial inner ring road north of the city walls. He recommended demolishing the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Queen Street, which the council mercifully did not do. He proposed demolishing the 15th century White Hart Inn in South Street because its plain stucco facade hid its medieval bones. It survived. He wanted to extend Princesshay across the Cathedral Green by demolishing part of the Devon and Exeter institution. The council blocked this too. Sharp was not a vandal. Exeter Phoenix is a serious work of mid-century urbanism by a man who believed in the English town. But there is a passage in the book that has haunted Exeter's architectural historians ever since. Writing about Bedford Circus, Sharp stated, "Bedford Circus has gone. The bombs shattered it to bits. It is so utterly destroyed that a man returning to Exeter can walk over its site without knowing he is doing so." This was not true. Margaret Tomlinson's photographs taken for the National Buildings Record in 1942 show the Georgian facades of Bedford Circus still standing. Gavin Stamp, the architectural historian, made the same point in Britain's Lost Cities. Immediately after the raids, the Georgian facades of Bedford Circus and the damaged parts of Southernhay were still standing. Surely they could and should have been shored up and retained. David Cornforth, the demolition historian who has tracked these losses building by building, put it more sharply. Sharp was either lying through his teeth or completely deceived about exactly what survived the Blitz. The answer is probably somewhere between the two. By the time Sharp arrived in late 1944, the City Council had already demolished much of what was salvageable. The question is whether Sharp knew what had been standing and chose to write as though it hadn't, or whether he genuinely surveyed a site already cleared by the council and assumed the bombs had done the clearing. Either way, the effect was the same. The authoritative plan for Exeter's reconstruction described Bedford Circus as though it had been erased by the Luftwaffe. In reality, it had been erased by the City Council, and Bedford Circus was not the only loss. The surviving Georgian facades were demolished in 1947. The remains of Bedford Chapel came down in October 1946. Hoskins thought it could have been retained. The gutted but salvageable shell of Della's Cafe, the building whose gabled brick walls, as Peter Thomas noted, had enough left to warrant preservation and rebuilding, was pulled down on the orders of Town Clerk C. J. Newman. Completely destroyed as a result of official policy, Thomas wrote. The surviving structure of Dix's Field, Regency stucco over sound walls, was demolished. The surviving facades of two terraces in Southernhay West were taken down. Number 37, High Street, a 16th century timber-framed merchant house that had come through the Blitz without a scratch, was demolished in the 1950s, and the Lower Market, Charles Fowler's granite masterpiece, stood as a gutted shell for 18 years before the council finally pulled it down in 1960. Its huge granite blocks were thrown into the Exe to shore up the riverbank. The architect, whose name was incised above the door, the same hand that signed Covent Garden, ended up as Phil in a Devon mudbank. Who made these decisions? The Replanning and Reconstruction Committee under successive mayors. Vincent Thompson, Conservative in 1944, Francis Henry Tarr, Labour in 1945, William Ooten Wills, a draper in 1946. Town Clerk C. J. Newman, who ordered the demolition of Della's. City architect John Bennett, who'd been in post since at least 1928, the man who designed the Burnt House Lane Garden suburb and the 1937 city swimming baths, and his post-war successor Harold Roe, who would go on to design the buildings that replaced what the council had torn down. The national context gave them cover. The 1947 Town and Country Planning Act handed local authorities sweeping new powers of compulsory purchase and redevelopment. Modernist ideology was the orthodoxy of the moment. Old buildings can't buy bread and butter, as one Exonian wrote in a letter quoted by Peter Thomas. Lewis Silkin, the minister who opened the Exeter Phoenix exhibition, was himself a champion of comprehensive redevelopment. The architectural press published Sharp's books in lavish blue cloth. The message from Whitehall was clear: the future is modern, and the past is a luxury the country can't afford. Public dissent was muted at first. Traders wanted to rebuild fast. The council was worried about rateable values. But through the 1950s, the voices grew louder. Hoskins, who'd been born on St David's Hill and knew every stone in the city, returned to Exeter in 1960 and founded the Exeter Group, later the Exeter Civic Society, in order that a voice be raised against some of the proposed redevelopment schemes. His 2000 Years in Exeter, published that year, is the foundational lament for what Exeter did to itself. He saved the higher market from demolition. He forced a partial rethink on extending the inner bypass across Bull Meadow. He was too late for Bedford Circus, for Dellers, for the lower market, for Bampfield House. The bombs in the end were not the worst of it. The bombs were 70 minutes of war. The demolitions that followed were years of peacetime choices made by named individuals in committee rooms with alternatives available and with Margaret Tomlinson's photographs sitting in an archive to prove that the buildings they were destroying had still been standing the morning after the raid. Chapter 8. Concrete and Carriageway. What replaced the medieval city was built quickly and built cheaply. Princess Hay opened as Britain's first pedestrianised shopping street, though Coventry and Stevenage have contested the title, with a foundation plaque unveiled by Princess Elizabeth on 21 October 1949. The development was named in her honour, plain 3- and 4-storey shop buildings of buff brick and Portland stone, with shop fronts at ground level, faced each other across a paved precinct. Bridget Cherry, writing the Pevsner Devon volume called The Post-War Shops Depressingly Shack-like. Bedford Street was widened into a square. The site of Bampfield House became a covered passage. The site of Bedford Circus, that Georgian ellipse of 22 red brick townhouses, the railed oval green, the chapel, became shop blocks. A stone column, the Princess A commemorative feature, marked the princess's visit. In 1960, city architect Harold Rowe completed St George's Hall and Market, a concrete and glass modernist building on the exact site of Charles Fowler's Lower Market. Where Fowler had used Haytor granite, neoclassical proportions, and sculpted bull's heads, Rowe used reinforced concrete, plate glass, and flat roof lines. Pevsner and Cherry's judgment was precise, a rather tatty effort in a belated festival of Britain spirit. It was the replacement for a building by the architect of Covent Garden. The granite blocks of the original were in the river. Then came the roads. The council had been planning an inner bypass since before the war, but it was the combination of bomb damage and the 1947 Act that gave them the authority and the excuse to push it through. Western Way, a 4-lane arterial road, was driven around the south of the city centre between 1953 and the early 1970s. Its route tore through Frog Street, Edmund Street, Magdalen Street, Holloway Street and parts of Cowick Street, areas that had escaped the Blitz entirely. Streets that the Luftwaffe hadn't touched, that had survived 4 Baedeker Raids without significant damage, were demolished for a dual carriageway. To make way for Western Way on Edmund Street, the council faced a problem. Number 16 Edmund Street was a 15th century timber frame merchant house, one of the medieval buildings that gave the West Quarter its near Tudor texture. The solution, over 9 days in December 1961, was to jack the building onto rails and roll it 220 feet along the street to a new location near St Mary Steps Church. The house that moved, as it became known, was saved. The irony was that it was moved to a spot where another 15th century timber-framed house had stood until the council demolished it in the 1940s. One medieval building replaced another medieval building on the same street because the road required it. The 1970s brought the final phase. The Guildhall Shopping Centre, a sprawling concrete mall, was built between 1974 and 1976 on the demolished line of Goldsmith Street, Waterbeer Street, the eastern side of North Street, and the remaining half of Paul Street. These were the narrow medieval lanes behind the High Street, the ones that had preserved the texture of the pre-war city even after the bombing, the ones whose intimate scale and irregular line had been set in the Middle Ages. They were replaced by an enclosed shopping mall with a multi-storey car park. Debenhams Tower, a 7-storey concrete slab, rose on Sidwell Street, where the old London Inn Square had been. Renslade House, a brutalist office block, went up on the western approach. Between 1946 and 1976, the City Council and its architects dismantled roughly as much pre-war fabric as the Luftwaffe had destroyed, and much of what they removed had never been touched by a bomb. The medieval lanes behind the High Street, the West Quarter streets, the Georgian terraces that were damaged but standing, the granite market hall that had stood as a shell for nearly 2 decades before anyone bothered to knock it down. Then, in the early 2000s, the cycle turned once more. In 2005, Land Securities and the Crown Estate began demolishing the entire 1950s Princess Hay precinct. The shack-like shops, the widened Bedford Street, the stone commemorative column. The new Princess Hay, designed by Chapman Taylor, Panther Hudspeth and Wilkinson Eyre at a cost of £235 million, opened on 20th September 2007, a modern shopping centre with apartments above. It won the British Council of Shopping Centres Supreme Gold Award and the International Council of Shopping Centres Award for Best Medium-Sized Centre in Europe. Archaeologists working during the demolition uncovered over a ton of Roman tile fragments, rare early 15th century pottery and 144 coins, one minted in Exeter around 1200. The city had demolished the medieval buildings to build the 1950s precinct, then demolished the 1950s precinct to build the 2007 shopping centre, and during the demolition of the replacement, they found the medieval city still waiting underground. Chapter 9. The Fragments Exeter Cathedral is the great survivor. Walk inside today and Thomas of Whitney's vaulting still runs unbroken from west to east. 96 metres of decorated Gothic stone, the longest continuous medieval vault in the world, exactly as it was before the incendiaries fell. The 60-foot bishop's throne is back in place. The misericords carved in the 1250s and 1270s are back. The great east window of 1390 is back. St James's Chapel, destroyed by the direct hit, was rebuilt in the 1950s with a memorial bench and a portrait of George Down, the post-war master mason, carved into the masonry. In November 2017, a memorial to the Polish 307 Squadron, the guardian angels of that May night, was unveiled in the chapel. The cathedral is wounded but whole. The vaulting holds. Around it the fragments persist. About 70% of the Roman walls still stand. The volcanic trap and purple breccia that Vespasian's engineers laid out 19 centuries ago, still marking the boundary of the city they founded. Rougemont Castle's Norman gatehouse, with its Anglo-Saxon long and short quoins, still stands in the northern angle of those walls, the earliest Norman castle building in England, unmoved and unburned. The Guildhall, with medieval cores behind a Renaissance portico of 1592-94 by Nicholas Baggett, remains Britain's oldest civic building in continuous use. Tucker's Hall, where 5 centuries of weavers and fullers met behind their barrel-vaulted roof, is open to visitors on 4th Street. Moll's Coffee House stands at No. 1 Cathedral Close, its Victorian Dutch gable facing the green. The Royal Albert Memorial Museum, the building Sharp wanted to demolish, survived both the bombing and the planners, and its Exeter Time Trail exhibition now tells the story of the city's destruction with a candour the post-war council never managed. The Higher Market, John Diamond's colonnaded hall of 1838, was saved from demolition by Hoskins Civic Society and is now a restaurant arcade. St Stephen's, St Mary Arches and St Mary Steps, all medieval churches, still stand. The timber-framed pair at Nussing, 41 and 42 High Street, and the cluster around them survive, Tudor bones behind later facades. The house that moved sits at its new home near St Mary Steps, a 15th century merchant house on rails, marooned by a road scheme on a spot where another medieval house used to be. On Catherine Street, the ruins of St Catherine's almshouses have been preserved as a war memorial since 1961. The marking time glass panel artwork, installed in 2008, catches the light through the broken walls of Canon Stephen's 15th century chapel. Beneath the rubble, the Roman mosaics discovered after the bombing remain in situ, the deepest layer of a city that has been building on top of itself for 2,000 years. The College of the Vicars Choral survives as 2 fragments of wall and 2 medieval window jambs, a scheduled monument behind a multi-storey car park. Bishop Brantingham's 14th century quadrangle, the oak-panelled dining hall, the 1629 Royal Arms above the fireplace, all of it reduced to 2 window openings and a stretch of masonry, officially protected, practically invisible. Gavin Stamp, surveying the whole in Britain's lost cities, delivered the verdict that the city has struggled to argue with. The cathedral remains glorious, but the city is certainly no longer a jewel. The city's relationship with its own past is uneasy and sometimes contradictory. The same council whose predecessors swung the wrecking ball now markets the house that moved and the cathedral as heritage attractions, as though the rest of the city's medieval and Georgian character had simply been Hitler's doing. The Exeter Civic Society, Hoskins' legacy, still campaigns. It lost the Stoneman and Bowker buildings on Sidwell Street in 2017 despite raising objections. The cycle hasn't stopped. What remains in Exeter is a cathedral of European importance, a near-complete Roman wall circuit, a handful of medieval churches, a few Tudor fragments, and the memory, in photographs, in Hoskins' prose, in the National Buildings Record Archive, of everything else. The buildings that Bedford Circus was, the streets that Goldsmith Street and Waterbeer Street were, the market that Charles Fowler built with Hayter granite and signed with his own name, the cafe with the sprung-floor ballroom, the almshouses over the Roman mosaics, the Elizabethan house where Charles V rode, between peace and plenty, on a carved overmantel that nobody thought to save. Exeter went into the war a small, intricate city whose character had been accumulating for 20 centuries. Roman walls enclosing medieval lanes, enclosing a cathedral that visitors crossed Europe to see. It came out of the post-war planners' hands as a small, intricate ring of medieval survivors, enclosed in a jacket of cheap concrete and dual carriageway. The cathedral vaulting still runs unbroken, 96 metres of stone, carved in the 14th century, holding up the roof that the incendiaries couldn't bring down and the planners didn't dare touch, everything that once surrounded it, the streets that gave it context, the buildings that gave it company, the city that gave it meaning, is photographs now. The walls hold, the vault holds. The city they were built for is gone.